Hi, and welcome back to Baking and Brewing with Bob and Domonic. Today, we're brewing a beer. It's going to be a Saison, which means that basically the only thing that we're doing is using Saison yeast. That's the main thing that gives it its taste. What we're going to do right now is we're about to mash in. So we've weighed out about 10 pounds of pale millet malt. We also have about 1.5 pounds of dehusked rice malt, and then we have 1 pound of cara millet malt. All of these should give a nice, great taste and complexity while still keeping the beer nice and light. And we are probably also going to age this on fruit. I have about 3 pounds of passion fruit that are going to go into this beer once primary fermentation is done. Before we mash in, the big focus is to make sure that the water is ready and is the right profile that we're looking for. So what I did is I added 2 teaspoons of calcium chloride, which should really help bring out that maltiness. And then I've balanced it with sulfates. So I have magnesium sulfate, or EPSOM salt. I put a teaspoon of that in there. I also put a teaspoon of calcium sulfate, which is known as gypsum. And then I rounded that off with a teaspoon of citric acid so that we could have a nice mash pH to make sure that our enzymes are working effectively. They actually work best between the pH levels of 5.2 to 5.6. So that's really kind of what my target is. Most of the time, gluten-free grains tend to be a little bit more alkaline. So what we've done is we've put in our little bit of our liquefaction enzyme, which is known as termamal, or if you buy it from gluten-free homebrewing, it's known as liquid alpha amylase, liquid endo-alpha amylase, I should say. And then we also are gonna, once we get down into the 155 degrees Fahrenheit, 150 degrees Fahrenheit range, we're gonna add C-vinyl L, which will be our gelatinization enzyme. That'll help us not only take the dextrins that the termamal has put into solution by touching the grains, but we're also going to turn those dextrins into various different glucose, maltose, maltotriose, and maltotetriose molecules. We've used RO. We have about 6 gallons in the mash kettle right now, and we're going to go and pour the grains in. So a lot of people ask, why such a high mash temperature? It's pretty high. Wouldn't you be killing all of the alpha amylase in there? Well, these grains aren't barley, so we're not really trying to preserve any of the intrinsic amylases. Millet tops out around 40 points on the conversion scale and in terms of enzymes. However, barley is at 120. That's 3 times the amount of enzymes that barley has that millet doesn't. So that's why we've already added a little bit of enzyme to the water. That makes sure that we're going to be able to get the right amount of starch conversion into sugars so that our happy Saison yeast can make a nice, healthy beer. Alright, so as we can see that from the mash-in, we've already lost about 5 degrees Fahrenheit. And what we're going to be doing now is recirculating. So the recirculating will help us lose temperature faster. We'll get us down to 155 quick. We'll add then the C-vinyl, which will be our gelatinization enzyme. And from there, we'll be pretty much good to go. The mash doesn't really need to take too long. A lot of people think that it would be a really long mash since you don't have a lot of intrinsic alpha amylase, but we're using concentrated commercial grade distillers enzymes, which work almost on contact with these grains. So what we're gonna do, recirc, get the temperature down, add the C-vinyl, stir it one more time, and we should be ready for almost sparge out at that point. So I'm using the Grain Father, which has a nice all-in-one system. We have our mash bucket in here, which is also serves as our kettle, and we also have a recirculation pump. We're going to turn that on. You should see a bunch of water shoot out. Dial that back in to a reasonable flow. We'll let that sit as the temperature drops down into the 155 Fahrenheit range. So we've just finished heating our sparge water, or water that we're going to use for our lautering. Lautering is separating the sugars from the grains. This water is heated about 174, 175 right now, as it really doesn't matter what temperature we sparge with, because there really isn't a lot of tannins in pale millet, number one. Number two is that we're gonna be headed up to boil anyways, and also sometimes the hotter it is, the easier the water flow. So we don't really worry too much about 168 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a typical sparge temperature. What we are looking for, though, is a good mash pH. So as long as our pH is under 6, we're not going to have much tannic extraction anyways for any grain that you use. So that's just a pro tip that I like to include. 5 o'clock somewhere. Coffee. Right, so I'm starting the sparge. We are putting the hot water that we just heated and washing the grains of their sugar. And the good news about the grain fodder that I'm using right now is this higher bucket allows for not only a more narrow mash bed. The depth is also usually a really good idea, but what it allows is it allows for pushing the water through by using gravity. Actually, during the mash, there was a couple times where it got a little bit stuck and the water got high during recirculation. So what I did is I just turned the pump off, let the water resettle, turn it back on. If it climbed too high, turn it off. You can play around with it, but you're still going to be able to get the sugar extraction from the grains. So millet's a really tiny little grain and it'll sneak through your false bottom sometimes, so I'm using a strainer or a sieve and I'm going to pull it through the mash water, and there's probably going to be a fair amount of millet that I pull out. Now's an important time to do something that I like to call a pre-boil gravity check. It's where you take about a cup off for your hydrometer, put it in the fridge till it gets down to about 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and that'll give you an accurate reading of how you did on your mash. We're looking for about 75%, maybe 80% efficiency today. So we're at boil. We're gonna put in our hop spider is what it's called. I don't know why it has the name spider. I guess it's because there's a really tight knit web here so that we don't get too much hop particulate in there. We have some pellet hops we're gonna bitter with BELMA, which has a nice citrus and tropical taste and aroma and appeal. And then we are going to use IDAHO 7, which has another tropical note. Since we're putting passion fruit in here, I'm really just leaning into the tropical note. I really wanna kind of amplify all of those flavors if possible, and also just bring a little bit of balance to it, because passion fruit, while it is tart, it is also vastly sweet, and that will leave a residual sweetness in the beer that we're going to be making. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that we're balancing that sweetness with some hot bitterness. 1 ounce of BELMA going down. Hey Google, 45-minute timer please. What we're going to do at 15 minutes, which is why I set a 45-minute timer on a 1-hour boil, is that we're going to add our Irish moss and yeast nutrient at that point to ensure that we have a great fermentation. The yeast nutrient has things like diammonium phosphate and B vitamin and other things that will help the yeast not only have energy, but also have healthy cell walls, which creates great flavors in your finished beer product. And the Irish moss is so that you have a nice clear wort. It really helps collect all of the different solids and sediments and precipitate them out of solution, which is really important to make sure that your finished product looks nice and clear and drinkable, very similar to a beer like this. It's time to put in our IDAHO 7. We're using CRYO hops today, but it's going to be a late hop, so it really won't give it much bitterness, but it will give it all of those fruity and tropical aromas that we're really looking for here. Now we're going to reconnect our elbow, and we are going to recirculate so that we get a nice, what is called a whirlpool. Whirlpool is really important for getting those hop aromas throughout the entire batch. So we have turned off our burner and we are now just recirculating until it gets to about 180 degrees, and then we will chill it all down. All right, so we've cooled our wort down to about 85 degrees because that's about as cool as I can get in SoCal. But we're going to use the power of our brew jacket to cool it down to about 75, which is what our primary fermentation temperature is going to be for this Saison. And I have a yeast in here that I'm going to pitch right now.
fermentation in full effect.